When a parking spot becomes a battlefield and an entitled neighbor disregards boundaries, Jack Thornton faces a choice: continue suffering or stand up for what's rightfully his. In a peaceful neighborhood where appearances matter most, a simple fence ignites a war over property rights, civility, and personal boundaries. Sometimes, the best way to teach a trespasser a lesson isn't through loud words, but through clever, decisive action. Can justice be delivered through cedar planks and metal posts? In this suburban showdown, the quietest revenge might just be the sweetest. I never considered myself a confrontational person. In fact, for the first 38 years of my life, I prided myself on being the diplomatic one, the guy who found middle ground when tensions flared. That all changed 6 months ago when Karen moved into the blue colonial 3 doors down from my modest ranch-style home in Oakwood Estates. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. Within 2 weeks of her arrival, she'd maneuvered her way onto the Homeowners Association board. Within a month, she was acting president after the previous one mysteriously stepped down. The whispers around the neighborhood suggested it wasn't entirely voluntary. Our first encounter seemed innocent enough. I was trimming my hedges when she approached, clipboard in hand, designer sunglasses perched on her highlighted blonde hair. "You must be Jack," she said, not as a question, but as an accusation. "I'm Karen Wilkes, HOA president. Your garbage bins were visible from the street last Tuesday. That's a violation of Covenant 16B. I apologized, explained I'd been working late, and promised to be more careful. She nodded curtly and strutted away. I thought that would be the end of it. The next morning, I opened my front door to find her silver Mercedes SUV parked in my driveway. Confused, I checked to make sure I hadn't somehow wandered into the wrong house. No, this was definitely my property. Her vehicle was blocking access to my garage, forcing me to park on the street. When I knocked on her door later that day, Karen answered with a phone pressed to her ear. "Hold on, Brenda," she said before covering the mouthpiece. "Can I help you?" "Your car is in my driveway," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. She rolled her eyes. "Your driveway is empty most of the day. Mine has my husband's car and my daughter's. I'll move it by 6. Then she closed the door in my face. This became a pattern. 3, sometimes 4 days a week, I'd find her Mercedes blocking my garage. Each time I confronted her, the excuses varied, but the dismissive attitude remained constant. "The street cleaning is today. I'm having landscapers over. It's just for a few hours. Don't be so territorial." I tried reasoning. I tried leaving notes. I even tried calling the HOA board, only to discover that Karen had somehow convinced them. This was a personal dispute, not worthy of official intervention. "You need to work it out between yourselves," said Tom from the board, his voice carrying the unmistakable tremor of someone afraid of crossing Karen. The final straw came last Tuesday. I had an important client meeting downtown, one I'd prepared for weeks. When I stepped outside at 7:30 a.m., there it was, Karen's Mercedes, positioned perfectly to prevent me from accessing my garage where my freshly detailed car waited. I rushed to her house, knocking firmly. No answer. I called her cell straight to voicemail. I texted, no response. In desperation, I called an Uber, arriving 20 minutes late to my meeting, flustered and unprepared. We lost the account. When I returned home that evening, the Mercedes was gone, but my patience had vanished with it. Through my living room window, I could see Karen in her front yard, directing a landscaper with imperious gestures. She caught my eye and had the audacity to wave cheerfully. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of Karen's smug smile kept me tossing and turning. Around 3 a.m., I remembered something. My college roommate, Mike, now ran a construction company specializing in rapid installations. I also recalled that according to county records I'd checked months ago during a different HOA dispute, my property line extended a full 2 feet beyond what most would consider my driveway. With trembling fingers, I sent Mike a text. Need a favor. Emergency fence installation. Will pay double your rate. His response came surprisingly quickly. For you? Triple rate and a case of that bourbon you've been hiding. When? I took a deep breath and typed, tonight before sunrise. As I pressed send, a strange calm washed over me. For the first time in months, I fell into a deep, peaceful sleep, dreaming of the look on Karen's face when she discovered what awaited her in the morning. Sometimes being diplomatic just doesn't cut it. Sometimes you need to build a fence. Mike's response came faster than expected. By 8 p.m., we were standing in my garage, blueprints spread across my workbench, bourbon in hand. The yellow glow of the overhead light cast long shadows as we plotted. So you want something substantial enough to send a message, but technically within code regulations? Mike asked, his pencil tapping rhythmically against the paper. I nodded, taking a slow sip from my glass. Exactly. Something that screams and is private property without screaming, I'm violating city ordinances. Mike's smile was wolfish. I've got just the thing. 6-foot cedar panels, concrete footings. We'll set the posts just inside your property line. That 2-foot buffer you mentioned gives us plenty of room. How fast can you get the materials? I asked. That's the beauty of having friends in construction, Mike replied, already typing on his phone. I've got leftover cedar from the Johnson project last week. High-end stuff they overordered. Posts, concrete, hardware, it's all sitting in my warehouse. As Mike made calls, I found myself staring out my kitchen window at Karen's house. Lights still blazed from every window, her silhouette occasionally passing by. Each glimpse fueled my resolve. By 10 p.m., Mike's truck rumbled quietly into my driveway, loaded with materials. His 2 most trusted workers, Luis and Darren, followed in a second vehicle. They worked with practiced efficiency, unloading supplies into my backyard, careful to minimize noise. We'll start at midnight, Mike whispered. By then, most of your neighbors should be asleep. I spent the next 2 hours pacing, alternating between doubt and determination. Was I overreacting? Then I remembered the missed client meeting, the countless mornings of frustration, Karen's dismissive wave. No, this wasn't overreacting, this was reclaiming what was rightfully mine. At exactly midnight, Operation Boundary Lesson began. Mike had brought battery-powered tools to reduce noise. Louise, a master with the post-hole digger, worked with silent precision. Darren mixed small batches of quick-setting concrete, while Mike measured and cut the cedar panels. I stood watch, scanning the neighborhood for any signs of movement. The night was mercifully quiet, with only the occasional distant dog bark breaking the silence. The moon, nearly full, provided enough light to work by, supplemented by low-powered headlamps. Jack, come hold this level, Mike called softly. As I steadied the tool against the first post, a strange exhilaration filled me. For months, I'd felt powerless against Karen's entitlement. Now, with each post that sank into the ground, with each panel that rose between our properties, I reclaimed a piece of my dignity. By 2 a.m., we had completed the most visible section, a beautiful cedar fence running precisely along my property line, effectively cutting off half of what Karen had been using as her personal parking space. The craftsmanship was impeccable, This wasn't some hastily erected barrier, but a professional installation that looked like it had always been there. "What about the gate?" I whispered to Mike. He grinned, gesturing to a pre-assembled cedar gate leaning against my garage. Remote-controlled electronic lock. "You can open it from your phone." "You think of everything," I said, genuinely impressed. "In my line of work, details matter," he replied, already directing Luis to hang the gate. By 4:30 a.m., as the first hints of dawn lightened the eastern sky, the fence was complete. Mike and his crew packed up their tools, leaving no trace of their nighttime activities except for the elegant cedar barrier now defining my property. "It's beautiful," I said, handing Mike an envelope with his payment and the promised case of bourbon. "It's more than beautiful," Mike replied, clapping me on the shoulder. "It's legal. I've got the property survey and permit applications ready to file first thing this morning. Retroactive permits are a thing, you know." As their trucks quietly pulled away, I stood in my driveway, admiring our work. The fence gleamed in the pre-dawn light, its cedar boards rich and aromatic. I ran my hand along the smooth wood, feeling a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in months. Karen typically arrived around 7:15 a.m. to park in my driveway before her morning yoga class. I checked my watch just enough time to shower, brew coffee, and position myself strategically by the front window. I wanted a clear view of her face when she discovered her actions had consequences. Inside, I set up my camera on a tripod, aimed discreetly through the blinds. This moment deserved documentation. As the coffee percolated, filling my kitchen with its rich aroma, I rehearsed what I would say when the inevitable confrontation came. For the first time in months, I felt completely at peace in my own home. The fence wasn't just a barrier, it was a statement. My property, my rules. Sometimes, the best response to entitlement isn't endless diplomacy, it's a firmly established boundary. I poured my coffee, settled into my armchair by the window, and waited for the show to begin. The morning light filtered through my blinds as I sat by the window, coffee growing cold in my hands. My eyes remained fixed on the driveway, now transformed by the elegant cedar fence. The birds had begun their morning chorus, a soundtrack to what promised to be an unforgettable performance. At precisely 7:12 a.m., Karen's silver Mercedes turned onto our street. I straightened in my chair, heart pounding against my ribs. She drove with her usual confidence, one manicured hand on the wheel, the other holding what appeared to be a protein shake. Her face showed the serene expression of someone who believed the world existed to accommodate her needs. That serenity shattered the moment she reached my driveway. Karen braked so suddenly that her body lurched forward against the seatbelt. For several seconds, she simply stared, her mouth forming a perfect O of disbelief. Then, as comprehension dawned, her face flushed crimson. She threw her car into park, right there in the middle of the street, hazard lights blinking indignantly. I adjusted my camera, ensuring it captured every detail of what followed. Karen exited her vehicle with such force that her designer purse tumbled onto the asphalt. She ignored it, stomping toward my fence in her yoga pants and expensive athletic top. Her hands ran along the cedar panels as if searching for a secret entrance. Finding none, she rattled the gate, discovering it firmly locked. "What the hell is this?" she shouted, her voice carrying across the morning stillness. Several neighbors' curtains twitched in response. I remained seated, savoring the moment. This was better than I'd imagined. Karen circled the fence, inspecting every inch, her movements becoming increasingly frantic. When she realized there was no way through, she marched to my front door and pounded with enough force to rattle the hinges. "Jack! I know you're in there. Open this door right now." I took one last sip of coffee, set down my mug, and moved unhurriedly to the door. I opened it wearing my most pleasant smile. "Good morning, Karen. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Her face contorted with rage. "What is that? That thing in your driveway? That thing is a fence," I replied calmly. "On my property. You can't just build a fence overnight." She sputtered, her perfectly highlighted hair quivering with indignation. "Actually, I can. It's within my property line, built to code, and the permit application has already been filed this morning." I held up my phone, showing Mike's confirmation text. Karen's eyes narrowed to slits. "You did this deliberately to block me." "Block you?" I feigned confusion. "From what?" "This is my private property, Karen. I wasn't aware you had any right to access it." "I've been parking there for months," she hissed, as if this established some sort of legal precedent. "Yes, without permission," I noted, "despite my repeated requests for you to stop." By now, several neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching our exchange with undisguised interest. Miss S. Abernathy, from across the street, didn't even pretend to be checking her mail. She stood openly staring, arms crossed, a smile playing at her lips. Karen noticed our audience and attempted to regain her composure, smoothing her yoga pants with trembling hands. "The HOA will hear about this. That fence violates at least 3 covenants." "I've already emailed the complete plans to the board," I replied, "including the property survey confirming it's entirely on my land. But feel free to bring it up at the next meeting." "You think you're so clever," she snarled, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "This isn't over." I leaned against my doorframe, the picture of relaxation. "Your car is blocking traffic, Karen, and I believe street obstruction is a violation of Covenant 12C. Her eyes widened at having her own tactics used against her. Without another word, she spun on her designer sneakers and stormed back to her illegally parked Mercedes. The engine roared to life, and she executed a 3-point turn with such aggression that her tires squealed against the asphalt. As she sped away, several neighbors broke into spontaneous applause. Tom from the HOA board gave me a discreet thumbs up from his porch. I waved acknowledgement to my unexpected supporters before returning inside, where I saved the video footage to my computer. Something told me I might need it later. The fence stood gleaming in the morning sun, not just a barrier of wood and metal, but a declaration of boundaries that should have been respected long ago. Round 1 to Jack. But something in Karen's parting glare told me the war had only just begun. The midday sun beat down on my front yard as I trimmed the hedges, a task I'd been neglecting for weeks. The new fence gleamed in the sunlight, its cedar panels already developing that rich amber patina that only quality wood acquires. I hummed contentedly, feeling more at peace than I had in months. My tranquility shattered at the sound of tires screeching against asphalt. Karen's Mercedes swerved into view, followed closely by a black and white police cruiser. Lights flashing, but siren mercifully silent. I set down my gardening shears with deliberate slowness, wiping my brow with the back of my gloved hand. Karen emerged from her vehicle like a tornado in designer clothing. Her face was flushed, her movements sharp with righteous indignation. Behind her, 2 officers exited the patrol car, one older, with salt and pepper hair, the other younger, with a military-style haircut. "That's him," Karen announced, jabbing a manicured finger in my direction. "That's the man who illegally constructed a barricade overnight to harass me." I removed my gardening gloves, tucking them into my back pocket as I approached. "Good afternoon, officers," I said, my voice steady and calm. "How can I help you?" The older officer stepped forward. "Sir, we've received a complaint about a fence that was allegedly constructed without proper permits. possibly encroaching on public property. Karen crossed her arms triumphantly. It's a clear violation. He built it specifically to block me. The younger officer pulled out a notepad. And you are? Karen Westfield. I live next door. She gestured dramatically toward her immaculate colonial. I've been parking in that driveway for months without any issues until he decided to erect this monstrosity overnight. I waited patiently for her tirade to end before addressing the officers. My name is Jack Thornton. This is my property. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my phone. I'd be happy to show you the property survey, which clearly indicates that the fence is entirely within my boundary lines. I also have the receipt for the expedited permit application that was filed this morning. The older officer, his nameplate read Martinez, reviewed the documents on my phone screen, scrolling carefully through each one. These appear to be in order, he said. The fence is clearly within your property line. Karen's jaw dropped. But he built it overnight. That can't be legal. Officer Martinez turned to her. Ma'am, as long as the structure is on private property and the appropriate permits are filed, the timing of construction isn't relevant. Many homeowners choose to complete projects during off hours to minimize disruption. But he only built it to block me from parking, Karen sputtered. The younger officer, Officer Reynolds, according to his badge, cleared his throat. Ma'am, were you parking on his property without permission? Karen blinked rapidly. Well, IWERE neighbors. It's just a driveway. So you were using his private property without authorization, Officer Reynolds clarified, making a note in his pad. I've asked her repeatedly to stop parking in my driveway, I added quietly. For months. I have text messages and witnesses to verify this. Officer Martinez nodded. Sir, your fence appears to be in compliance with local ordinances. The property line is clear and you filed for the proper permits. Karen's face contorted with disbelief. You can't be serious! He's obviously doing this to harass me. Protecting one's property isn't harassment, ma'am, Officer Reynolds replied. In fact, unauthorized use of someone else's property could potentially be considered trespassing. At the word trespassing, Karen's face paled visibly. Several neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the police presence. They stood in small clusters, watching the scene unfold with undisguised interest. Is there anything else we can help you with today? Officer Martinez asked, clearly ready to conclude this call. Karen looked around desperately, suddenly aware of her audience. Miss S. Abernathy was recording the entire exchange on her phone. Tom from the HOA board stood with arms crossed, shaking his head slightly. I'll be bringing this up with the Homeowners Association, Karen declared, her voice rising to ensure everyone heard. This fence violates neighborhood aesthetics. Tom stepped forward. Actually, Karen, I've already reviewed the plans. The fence meets all HOA guidelines for materials, height, and placement. It's quite tasteful, really. A ripple of murmured agreement passed through the gathered neighbors. Karen's shoulders slumped slightly, the wind visibly leaving her sails. If there's nothing else, Officer Martinez said, closing his notebook, we'll be on our way. Have a good day, folks. As the officers returned to their cruiser, Karen stood frozen in my front yard, the weight of public humiliation settling over her. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her almost. Then I remembered all those mornings of frustration, the missed meetings, her dismissive attitude. Your yoga class starts in 15 minutes, I said quietly. You might want to find alternate parking. Without another word, Karen turned and walked stiffly back to her car. As she drove away, I could have sworn I saw tears glistening in her eyes. The neighbors dispersed slowly, several giving me approving nods as they returned to their homes. I picked up my gardening shears and resumed trimming my hedges, the rhythmic snip, snip, snip oddly satisfying in the afternoon quiet. Round two to Jack, but somehow the victory felt hollow. The weeks following the police incident brought a remarkable transformation to Maple Avenue. The summer heat settled over our neighborhood like a warm blanket, but something else had changed, a palpable shift in the social dynamics that even the most oblivious resident couldn't miss. Karen's silver Mercedes now appeared exclusively in her own driveway or garage. Each morning, I watched from my kitchen window as she emerged from her house, keys clutched tightly in her hand, her eyes deliberately avoiding any glance toward my property. Her once confident stride had diminished to a hurried walk, shoulders slightly hunched as if expecting judgment from invisible observers. The fence stood proudly in the morning light, its cedar panels weathering beautifully into a rich honey tone. I'd added flower boxes along the top edge, cascading with purple petunias and trailing ivy, a touch that had earned compliments from everyone except, of course, Karen. "You've started quite the trend," Miss S. Abernathy remarked one evening as she walked her corgi past my yard. "Did you see that the Hendersons are putting in a similar fence next week? Everyone's talking about property boundaries these days." I smiled, offering her homegrown tomatoes from my basket. "I'm just glad things have quieted down." "Oh, they haven't quieted at the book club," she chuckled, accepting the vegetables with a wink. "Karen hasn't shown her face there since. Well, you know, Patricia says she's joined a new yoga studio clear across town. The neighborhood grapevine worked with remarkable efficiency." Stories of the driveway standoff, as it had come to be known, circulated with increasing embellishment. In some versions, Karen had threatened me with legal action. In others, she'd attempted to dismantle the fence herself. The truth was dramatic enough without exaggeration, but I never bothered to correct the tales. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, as I returned from the grocery store, I spotted Karen struggling with several shopping bags at the end of her driveway. Her umbrella had flipped inside out, and rain poured mercilessly down her face. Our eyes met briefly, hers wide with something between embarrassment and defiance, before she quickly looked away. For a moment, I considered offering help. The feud had lost its satisfaction weeks ago, leaving behind a hollow victory that tasted increasingly bitter. But before I could decide, she'd gathered her belongings and disappeared inside her house, door closing firmly behind her. That evening, as thunder rolled across the sky, I sat on my porch, watching lightning illuminate the fence in brief, brilliant flashes. The barrier that had once represented my triumph now seemed like a monument to a petty neighborhood squabble. Had I overreacted? Perhaps. But boundaries, once violated repeatedly, required clear demarcation. The following morning, I found a small envelope tucked into my mailbox. Inside was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. "Jack, I've been advised by several people to formally apologize for my behavior regarding your driveway. While I still believe neighbors should be more accommodating to one another, I recognize that I overstepped. The fence is your right. Regards, Karen." Not quite an apology, but as close as someone like Karen could manage. Progress, of a sort. That weekend, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue. Nearly everyone attended. Even Tom from the HOA board brought his famous potato salad. Karen's absence was conspicuous, but expected. As evening fell and lanterns illuminated my backyard, conversation flowed easily among neighbors who now greeted one another with newfound respect for boundaries. To good fences, Tom raised his glass in a toast, and the good neighbors they sometimes create. Everyone laughed, clinking glasses beneath the summer stars. The cedar fence stood silently at the edge of my property, no longer a battleground but simply a boundary clear, respectful, and necessary. In time, perhaps Karen would understand that respect flows both ways, that boundaries aren't barriers to community but foundations upon which good relationships are built. Until then, my driveway remained gloriously, peacefully empty except, of course, for my own car, exactly where it belonged. Years have passed since the fence first appeared on Maple Avenue, yet its lesson remains etched in our neighborhood's collective memory. The cedar has weathered to a distinguished silver gray, standing as a silent sentinel to a simple truth: respect is not optional, but essential. Some battles in life require more than words. When faced with those who refuse to acknowledge boundaries, a creative yet lawful response often speaks volumes where conversation fails. My fence, that simple structure of wood and metal, accomplished what months of frustrated requests could not. Karen and I exchange cordial nods these days. Nothing more. Her car never strays beyond her property line. The neighborhood has found its balance, each resident more mindful of where their rights end and another's begin. Sometimes, the most powerful message requires no words at all, just the quiet dignity of a boundary, clearly marked and firmly maintained.